So thank you very much for coming, and Rob, I assume I'm on time, and colleagues online will be now on live and hearing us. So welcome to those who've joined us virtually. I welcome you from various parts of the world. Quite a lot of people had signed up, and I hope they are listening, but welcome to those of you who are here in London as well on a rainy afternoon. Particular welcome to my friend Neville Trotz in Belize, who's got up very early to be at his desk at the Caribbean Climate Change Centre in Belize this morning to share his perspectives. So big welcome to you, Neville. Thank you. You're very clear on our screen, so it's good to see you there. My name is Sam Bickersteth, and I'm the Chief Executive of CDKN, and we're very pleased to be sharing with you a discussion, a paper, and having with you a discussion on the very important issue of tackling climate change in relation to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm obliged to the housekeeping announcements, and that is, if there's a fire alarm this afternoon, you're required to go outside and get wet, because it would be a real fire alarm and not a practice. So please take that, go quickly out in that direction. The toilets are straight down the end behind a door that doesn't mark them, so good luck in finding them if you were to need them. The only other logistical announcement is that we had hoped to have a second speaker joining us online, Chibet Maiku, who's the lead climate negotiator for the government of Uganda, and who we also work with, and Anil in particular has been working closely with him and colleagues in Kampala and in Uganda, but unfortunately technology hasn't worked in this respect, and we've not been able to get the link in place, so that's a little disappointing. But we have a great panel, and I'm going to introduce them to you now, including perfect timing from Andrea. Welcome. I'll put you on the end there, Andrea, because that's the last available seat, but welcome very much. Thank you very much for joining us. So the format is a presentation from our collaborators from HR Wallingford and Metroeconomica, Nigel Walmsley and Anwar Kandia. We'll then have comments from Dr. Trotz in the Caribbean, followed by Andrea Ledwood, who's just arrived on my left, who is the head of department for DFID's Climate and Environment Department. So welcome to Andrea. Thank you very much for joining us, given your involvement and leadership across these issues of climate change. It's great to have your perspectives. Andrea is the UK board representative of the Green Climate Funds, amongst other things, so very much involved in this issue about finance for development that extends beyond climate change and cuts across more broadly into development finance. And then, in a sense, we have the home team member, Ilmi, to my right, Ilmi Granoff, who's a research fellow here working and leading ODI's work on green growth. Ilmi's worked with the African Development Bank, amongst other things, as a lawyer, so we'll bring a number of perspectives. But we do want to hear from you as well, both of those of you online and in the room. At some point, I'll get a tablet which has questions on it, so do prepare your questions. Those online, they can send them in to me early, and we can bring those into the room. I have to keep an eye on the time, of course, so we've got an hour and a half, and there will be more tea and coffee at the end, I understand. So just a couple of short things to say about why CDKN commissioned this work, and why we are engaged in this issue. I mean, I think essentially it's not an exaggeration to say that 2015 offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle the issues of development and climate change in a coherent way. The SDG conversation, thank you, Charlotte, and the UNFCCC talks at the end of the year, of course, obviously coupled with the financing for development talks, the Sendai talks that we've had earlier in the year, and of course the World Humanitarian Summit coming up in less than 12 months. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say this is an incredibly important moment for the next 15 or so years. CDKN is the Climate and Development Knowledge Network And we have promoted unashamedly the need for climate-compatible development. That's action on climate change that works in favour of poor people, that supports economic growth and poverty reduction. And quite clearly, the world in which we work sits across at least two silos. One's called the UNFCCC and another's called the SDG debate. And it's very clear that those silos have not been terribly well connected. That observation has been mentioned many times before this year and earlier. It's nothing new. As CDKN, we wanted to try and bring a bit of evidence on how those interconnections needed to be seen as one, to tackle the silos and to tackle the interconnections between climate change and sustainable action on poverty reduction and growth. I think what we have done with our colleagues from HR Wallingford is one of the first attempts to look at the interface of SDGs and climate policy in a quantitative way in the framework of the SDGs to 2030. The IPCC's fifth assessment doesn't really look to that shorter time period, precisely because the climate change effects will not be very great in the next 15 years. So it was a big challenge that we set for our colleagues to try and draw out a quantitative way and look at the policy implications. And of course the implications are massive, and they're not marginal implications, because the SDG goal is to eliminate poverty by 2030, not halve poverty. And so an adjustment in the figures as a consequence of climate change makes a big difference if you're trying to eliminate poverty. So I think this is an exciting paper. It's a contribution. More needs to be done. And I look forward to your comments on how we can build on it. So first of all, I would like to turn to the principal authors of the paper for this afternoon. And Nigel, I think, is going to lead. Welcome to you, Nigel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the impact of climate change on the achievement of the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. I think, as Sam says, it was a challenging task, and I think the sort of partnership working together has paid dividends at the end of the day. I think one of the key purposes was really to strengthen the evidence base, to look at the interrelationship between the climate agreement and achievement of the SDGs. So, as Sam says, two of the global processes that are due to be completed in the coming months. Sam mentioned something quite important there, that in fact the time frame, we were looking at 2015 to 2030. And I think that is critical. So the duration of the SDGs, where actually the global warming and a climate agreement will not necessarily impact significantly on climate change during that period. So it's less of an impact study, climate impact study, and more of an economic analysis of the interrelationships between those. I think the other thing is that we're really looking at ambition, an ambition in the climate agreement, an ambition in the conclusion of the SDGs. I'll just present a few of the headline figures and then talk a little bit about the methodology, but then I will hand over to Anil, who will cover in more detail some of the case study examples that we have from the work. So really the key messages are twofold: that strong SDGs will help achieve a more ambitious climate agreement, and that an ambitious climate agreement will help to achieve the SDGs. So it's in the report we talk about this as a virtuous circle, I think, and that interrelationship between the two of them. So ambition between a strong and a weak climate agreement in the first instance. So we're looking at comparing and contrasting those two outcomes from a low ambition and a high ambition agreement. And the headline figures in terms of poverty, when we looked at this on a regional level, was at the 80% to 140% higher poverty levels for Asia and sub-Saharan Africa by 2030 with a low ambition, and 25% higher poverty levels for Latin America and the Caribbean, again for a low ambition climate agreement. Now that's contrasting the high and the low climate agreements. We did look at all the SDGs, so the full 17 SDGs, and there's more detail of that within the reports themselves. Some of the other ones that showed a marked difference were inequality, clearly contributing to combating climate change, and also global partnerships, etc. In terms of the method, the low ambition and the high ambition, in terms of trying to define those, we actually paired together different scenarios for the representative climate projections and the socioeconomic projections. So we paired those together for a high ambition and a low ambition. I think it's fair to say that we can't be absolutely certain that that pairing that we've chosen will actually be the outcome. But I think there's quite a lot of emerging literature to suggest that this would be the case. And for example, the new climate economy was one of the reports that we drew on. In terms of the process that we went through, we really looked, start point was a climate agreement with a high and low ambition. I think then we moved on to how that would influence policy responses at regional or country level. So how that would influence climate policy, how it would influence financing, and in particular development pathways. Moving that forward was then the outcomes in terms of socioeconomic pathways within the countries, so social, economic and environmental outcomes, and then mapping that onto achievement of the SDGs. We did that initially at a global or regional level, so we looked at Africa, Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. Then, I think very importantly, we did deeper dive country case studies. So we did Dominica, Jamaica, Pakistan and Uganda. And they represented different development contexts. So we had LDCs in their middle income countries and the SIDS countries that are particularly prone to vulnerabilities from climate change, or they have unique vulnerabilities. Within those country case studies, we looked at 4 SDGs. So for poverty, gender inequality, water and sanitation, and energy, and analysed those in much greater detail. I think as importantly, we also compared and contrasted those country findings with those that we had for the regional findings. We took both a quantitative and qualitative approach. So we had some integrated assessment modelling, which was done by Metroeconomica to look at the poverty and particularly energy as well. But we made best use of peer review literature, expert elicitation, and we also took a backward look to see how development pathways had impacted on achievement of the MDGs. And then we tried to use that also to help inform us in terms of a forward-looking trends in terms of achieving the SDGs. So the 4 country case studies, I'll hand over to Anil for these.
Thank you. I'll say a few words, and thank you, Nigel. I'll say a few words on the case studies. The first one refers to the Caribbean countries, that's Dominica and Jamaica, and these were selected to represent island states where vulnerability to climate change is high, small economies with low population and low emissions. They have relatively high energy expenditure, and they're both, and other countries in the region are keen to expand domestic energy supplies. They're also keen to increase the use of renewable technologies. So in a number of ways, they would welcome a strong agreement. They've indicated that in their communications. And they also want to have access to, they believe that this will give them access to more resources for investment and to be able to reach their energy targets for energy efficiency. Sorry, am I going the wrong way? In terms of poverty, we have estimates of the current levels of poverty in these countries, about 500,000 people in Jamaica. These are national poverty lines, about 20,700 in Dominica. And we estimate that if the economy proceeds along a high ambition scenario, this can be reduced to the figures shown here, about 180,000 in Jamaica and 10,000 in Dominica. Under a low ambition scenario, the reductions are significantly less by 2030. But this is just the direct links between growth and poverty, which have been used to estimate those figures. In addition, we know from a number of sources that poverty impacts in these countries are greater than the analysis from the LAC countries as a whole would suggest. And we discuss in the report how extreme events would exacerbate poverty in these island states. And now there is an emerging literature which shows that such events as hurricanes and cyclones have a significant impact on GDP. The potential, the document also finds potential for women to benefit from climate financing. We'll give some examples of that from the countries' case studies. And for these two countries, energy is one of the more important targets in terms of development. And a high ambition agreement would create, the report indicates, create the right policy framework and help them to finance the energy transition to low carbon, which they are keen from, both from a climate point of view, but also from an energy security point of view. This graph takes a little bit of getting to understand, but is intended to try to indicate for the 4 SDGs that Nigel mentioned: poverty, gender equality, water and sanitation, and energy, the difference between what we think the risks are of attaining those goals with a high ambition scenario and with a low ambition scenario. And the color coding is red is bad, and as you get down to the dark green is the best, and yellow is somewhere in between. There are 2 reds, one is very red and one is just slightly red. The expectations for each of for the global level, for the region as a whole, we show them at the top. And we also try to indicate on a judgmental basis what is our confidence in these figures. So the darker the blue, the higher the confidence; the lighter the blue, the lower the confidence. Those the chart shows you then for the global level, but also for the 2 countries we looked at as case studies, and you can see that there's some improvement with regard to gender equality, water and sanitation, and energy, but there's a significant improvement, we think, with regard to poverty in going from the low to the high ambition scenario for Dominica. Similarly for Jamaica, the biggest gains seem to be in terms of the SDG 1. The next study was in Pakistan, where we looked at a number of issues, but the overall picture is that they are looking to develop their own internal renewable resources. Particularly, the country is in a significant energy shortage, and they have a major concern that growth is being constrained by this energy, the energy limits with shortages. There is a need to have a significant investment to increase both water and food security, and there is the promotion of rapid, sustainable urban growth. This is within their internal growth vision of the country. Our review suggests that the High Ambition Agreement would provide benefits in terms of support for renewable energy growth. It would provide greater investment in infrastructure and adaptation finance for agriculture, for the agricultural and water sectors. The poverty figures indicate to us that if they could get the high ambition scenario, they could achieve the full 2030 target of eliminating poverty. In this case, we could use the poverty indicator, $1.25 a day. We couldn't use that earlier because those countries didn't collect the data for that indicator. If on the other hand the world proceeds and the country proceeds on a low ambition scenario, the reduction will be from about 25 million to around 9 million, 25 million to 9 million. So compared to the average for South Asia as a whole, the effect of a strong agreement is much greater in Pakistan. Pakistan has suffered very significantly from extreme events. Floods have caused devastation and has contributed a lot to the poverty problems of the country. They also feel that the financial backing for the kinds of investments they need in these sectors is more likely under a strong agreement. And the water sector needs significant resources, and there are estimates in their internal development plan for that. We argue that a strong climate agreement would increase water infrastructure and the investment in water to meet those targets. The energy deficit is critical in the country, as I mentioned, and the need for action is urgent. And again, climate finance would help to develop hydro and renewable resources. So the picture, this is returning to the way we present the data in this format, this graphic format. We can see the significant benefits both in terms of poverty, gender equality, water and sanitation, and energy. Both globally means for the whole region, and then for the country as a whole. The figures, yes, the indication we go in a number of cases from the red to the green or the yellow in this chart. Uganda is the fourth country we looked at. The country has a program for major infrastructure investments. It is also a country which is staring at a significant deficit in terms of energy availability, energy supply, because almost the entire country depends on traditional energy sources at the present time, and modern energy is a very small part of the energy picture in the country. But the aim is to move towards a more efficient, low-carbon system, including a transport system. And the energy system that they want would be one that develops also some of their own low-carbon indigenous resources, including hydropower. The high ambition agreement benefits we identify include greater emphasis for renewables and for non-fossil resources, and the possibility of greater external finance to achieve those goals. In terms of poverty, the country has been rather, although it has been growing quite rapidly, the effects of that growth on poverty have been rather slow. So the elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to growth is very low for Uganda. And that's why we see that with a low ambition scenario, we believe the poverty could actually increase by 2030. It would need a high ambition scenario to make any dent in those figures. And that might change, and maybe those figures need some reconsideration, but this was our first attempt to look at it. So in neither case do we believe that the goal of extreme poverty reduction is met, but the water sector imbalances which are present due to the water deficit are likely to be exacerbated by climate change. The figures indicate that already there are problems in matching supply and demand in the eight basins of the country. This is likely to increase with climate change, but the support to be able to deal with that is likely to be more forthcoming under a strong agreement. The energy sector links between developing this modern energy and phasing out high dependence on traditional biomass is another big challenge for the country, and one which we think has a better chance of being met through a high ambition scenario. This is the picture we see in aggregate terms. Just that looking at the low and the high ambition, I'm nearly done. The comparison between for the four scenarios, and again we see low ambition significantly in the red, high ambition moving towards the green and the yellow. This work was quite difficult to do because we had to work with rather limited data and information, and we consider it as a start to looking at the link between climate change and the SDGs and development goals more generally. We feel that more understanding is needed in a number of areas. One is, and perhaps first, is how these development pathways might change due to alternative warming and decarbonization scenarios. We haven't had a chance to look at that, and there is now an emerging literature which suggests that there is a link between growth paths and the way in which we proceed to decarbonize. We want to be able to understand better the link between extreme events and poverty. Again, that's something which a number of other people are working on, including some work taking place in the World Bank, which I've just recently been following. We have significant co-benefits of low-carbon energy development, which we didn't incorporate fully in this assessment. We mention them, we look at them very briefly, but there is more we could say on that. There are links between water and sanitation and the health SDGs, and again, we didn't have enough time to explore those. And then we'd like to be able to extend the country-level analysis to cover more of the SDGs and to cover more countries. So really and finally, we'd like some more and better quantitative data on the gender metrics. Well, that's about the concluding. The last slide here. The high ambition agreement will pave the way towards eradicating poverty, ensuring food security and protecting future generations from impacts of climate change. It's likely to provide significant benefits to both the climate and development agendas, and is essential in our view to having the best chance of achieving the SDGs by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Markandia. So the scenarios, there's some numbers, there's degrees of confidence, there's traffic light systems. There's probably quite a lot of questions in your head about the methodology and the results, and it's not that easy to digest. I've been looking at this as it's evolved over several months. So be patient, but do gather up your questions. I'm going to pass in a moment to Dr. Trotz in Belize to bring his comments. I have just got a written comment from Uganda, which is very nice. But I think I failed to introduce Dr. Wormsley and Professor Markandia properly, but both of them said this was quite difficult, and I do appreciate their willingness to rise to the challenge. Nigel Worms has got 20 years plus of experience working on integrated water resource management, and Professor Markandia is an environmental economist who's been working on these challenges for over 30 years, and we very much welcome the fact that you rose to the challenge. Your centre, the Basque Climate Change Centre in Bilbao, was, I think, prize-winning regarded climate change policy think tank, and it's been really great to draw on your wide experience as an experienced, in fact, leader of the, I notice you're currently president of the European Environmental and Resource Economists. So we've got the best brains applying to a difficult subject. And I think you recognise this isn't perfect, but it's a scenario-based approach to try and draw out these linkages. So catch your thoughts and bring them to me in a minute. But first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Ulrich Trotz, known as Neville Trotz, who's the Deputy Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre, partner of CDKN in a number of work in that region. Dr. Trotz is an IPCC author, I think worked alongside you, Professor Markandia, in the year that you won the Nobel Prize for that work. So that's quite a thing. And many years of wisdom from working in this field. So Neville, we'd love to hear your response to what you've heard and read so far on this. You'll have to unmute yourself first.
Thank you very much, Sam, and good morning, everybody. Well, good afternoon there, and greetings from the 5 Seas in Belize, where it's not raining outside, it's sunny and bright. I wish you could have been at this venue. Just a few comments. First, congrats for this report. I think it was an excellent idea and it's a very well-crafted report. I'd like to make a few quick comments, though, on the key messages. There is no doubt that an ambitious climate agreement will help achieve the SDGs. But the other message that the strong SDGs will help to achieve a more ambitious climate agreement raises some questions in our minds, because from our perspective, this could only occur if there was a more deliberate and integrated approach to the two processes. Certainly here in the Caribbean, our climate change negotiators are totally isolated from those who are part of the sustainable development discussions. And as such, we have lost the opportunity of having one inform and influence the outcome of the other. On the last slide, however, I think there is better language that didn't engender this sort of doubt, and that is that strong SDGs will support efforts to implement a more ambitious climate agreement. I think I'm much more comfortable with that. There's a suggestion, an assertion in the way it's now crafted that having strong SDGs will help us to move towards a high ambition agreement in Paris. I think we need to be cautious with the statement that climate impacts before 2030 may not differ greatly under a strong or weak climate agreement. And the facts are there, that is certain. But you see, when we're dealing with short-term horizons of our political directorate, such a statement might encourage them to think that they can postpone decision on a strong climate agreement, as there is no urgency and nothing significant can be done to deal with the inevitable, and they might adopt a least action pathway. So it's just a question of what message that might send, even though it's an accurate message, what message it might send to the political directorate. I think one message that this study could have highlighted, and is that coming out of this study, that is a simple one. Climate action is developmental action. Inherent in this message is the idea that there's opportunity for that climate action offers to help us achieve development goals, and the need for its full integration into national development plans. That is full integration of climate action into national development plans. And I think that's a very strong message, basically, that we should not ignore the power of that message for policymakers. A quick word about energy. I think that the suggestion for future research on exploring the many co-benefits of a low-carbon energy development program and how these relate to sustainable development goals, I think that study should be conducted as early as possible. If you look at all of the studies, basically the case studies, there's a strong inference there about energy. For us, it's a case of energy affordability. We in the Caribbean are designated one of the most carbon-intensive regions in the world. And energy, basically, unless we deal with changing the architecture of our energy sector, then we might as well forget development as articulated under the SDGs. We have to find a way in which we could move away from fossil fuels, not because of a mitigation sort of signal, but because our very survival depends on that in the future. And certainly, a high ambition agreement will facilitate the movement of the Caribbean into a low-carbon development pathway. So energy basically is not about pulling the low amount of emissions out from the atmosphere, but really the survival of our economic system. We're not competitive in manufacturing, in services, in anything that we do because the energy cost is high. One observation, under the high ambition scenario, it calls for socio-development pathway where policies are in place for relatively rapid income growth and substantially reduce reliance on natural resources. Now, what I want to bring out here is that it's not only national policy, but global policy that we need to worry about. For us in the Caribbean, again, in terms of reducing our reliance on natural resources, some of our countries have tried to establish financial services sector. But right now, global policy is such that it has decimated this sector in some of our Caribbean countries. So the only alternative for them basically is to revert to business as usual and further exploitation of natural resources. The point I want to make is that there is a disconnect between what we are expected to achieve under the SDGs and what is happening at a different level in global policy. And finally, I think the goal 2, the food security, I think that is also a critical area where we need to carry out a detailed study, because food security basically, apart from food security, is tied up a lot with livelihoods in the Caribbean, and hence tracking back not only to hunger but to poverty. I think those are my brief remarks, Sam.
Thanks very much, Neville, indeed. That was good stuff, and we are wide awake listening to every word there, because that is stark and very much responding to the challenges. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to just share the few very brief words from our colleagues in Uganda before passing to Andrea, if I may. So Chibet Malu, who's the Commissioner for the Climate Change Department of Uganda, is as frustrated as we are that he's not been able to link up and comment today, because he expresses here his pleasure that we've supported this important study on the impact of climate change on SDGs and post-2015 goals for Uganda. He concurs that Uganda agrees with the findings that a strong and high ambition agreement limiting global warming to 2 degrees is critical to Uganda's achievement of the SDGs and picks up on the poverty, gender equality, water, sanitation, energy ones as set out in the report. So he's very much concurring with the findings, and that they agree that a strong set of SDGs needs to be agreed this year to achieve this high ambition to a climate agreement within that limit. So essentially a strong endorsement from our colleagues in Uganda, which is good to hear. And we work together, Dr. Markandian and ourselves, in partnership with them. So I think there's every opportunity to take that conversation forward, if not right now. So thanks very much to Chibet and Revocatus Twinamahungi, who's our colleague based in the university in Kampala. So I would like to pass to Andrea. Thank you again for joining us, Andrea. Andrea, I hope most of you know, is the head of the Climate and Environment Department for DFID and has worked for DFID, run their program in Ethiopia, and has had a number of wide-ranging other jobs in DFID and across the UK civil service. So it's great, Andrew, you're in the thick of these issues, I'm sure. It'd be good to get your perspectives.
Brilliant, thanks. So Sam, I'll make 4 kind of brief comments about the report itself and then kind of 4 more general points, hopefully take us into a conversation where I'd be really interested to kind of hear other people's views actually and kind of questions and responses. So the comments on the report itself, I think one is that, you know, we fully agree that a high ambition agreement which aims to limit the global warming, gives the best chance for poverty reduction, and we see very much climate change and poverty reduction being 2 sides of the same coin. So overall, we very much agree. I think the 3 more specifics are, I also was a bit surprised with the assertion about the climate impacts before 2030 might not be very different, because I think politically, politicians can read that in very different ways, and it can sometimes detract from the imperative to do something. So I think I would be a little wary with an assertion on the front page around that. My second comment would be that the case studies are really interesting, and I'd be very interested in particular in unpicking some of the data behind it and seeing how it compares with the ongoing growth diagnostics work that the DFID country offices are leading at the moment, and also the strategic country diagnostic work that the World Bank is leading in a number of these countries at the moment. Because both the World Bank and DFID are doing a lot of analytical work at a country level at the moment, thinking about growth trajectories and factoring in resources and sustainability issues to that. And I'd be really interested to see how the data and the analysis kind of stacks up really in the context of those 2. And the third one is, I think I'd really encourage a bit more on the gender side. I think I kind of didn't really hear the women and the girls' voices very strongly, and the characters. So I think, again, just kind of continuing to amplify those voices and understanding what it really means for women in particular in society, I think is something that we need to amplify more through many of the reports. So the report is really timely, and then I think my kind of then moving on to 4 more general comments that I'd make. I think the first one is that actually the UK government is doing an awful lot this year in 2015 to integrate, going through financing for development, the post-2015, the Paris COP, and then going through to the WTO Trade Ministerial at the end of the year, and then even into the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. We're certainly seeing them all together, and we're seeing each of those events as very important in their own right, but also as a very important trajectory and very important interlinked. So we certainly are integrating, speaking to our negotiators all the time, actually, about our handling through all of these events. So we are, and we see others doing exactly that as well. So that's the first point about the international action. I think the second point is that the case for tackling poverty and climate change together, I think, is very well evidenced. It's evidenced here, and I think it is very clear, particularly through the food security, the energy and the water lens. And I think it's always very helpful actually to bring it down to specific sectors to give some tangibility to the evidence and some immediacy and make it come alive for people. I think the third point then is really what is DFID doing, what's the UK government doing on some of this? And I think it's very clear through the International Climate Fund, which is the £3.87 billion that the government's got for this spending review period at the moment, that is all about integration of development and climate. That's very much about how can we do this in an integrated way. And so you can see the work that we're doing, which looks at how can we drive lower carbon pathways in countries, which is leapfrogging and using technology to leapfrog over having to use dirty coal and dirty fuels to use renewables, which is looking at how we build resilience in communities to manage risks effectively. We've got a real flagship programme called Braced, Building Resilience and Adapting to Climate Extremes and Disasters, which is really our flagship programme in that. We have a few forestry flagship programmes, which are, again, really at the heart of some of the very complicated governance issues and political economy issues about who has access to forests and resources, as well as then trying to protect those to limit the emissions at a kind of global level. And then some work on the private sector side, mobilising the private sector finance, in particular in the energy area. And all of that is about integrating an approach to tackling poverty at the same time as trying to reduce the impacts of climate change. So I think for me, the kind of final point really is what next? So I think, we're very far advanced in the post-2015 discussions at this point. We have a set of goals and targets, and I think there's a realism about the extent to which they're going to be unpicked or changed at this point. So we have a set. So now I think the really important question is, how is the world going to respond to those SDGs, and what are we going to do about implementing them, actually? So there's a global architecture question, which I think is really interesting. And what does that mean for how we're kind of all organised? What does that mean for integrating of different finance flows so that climate finance is no longer separate and additional, but it's integrated, and we're breaking down that kind of firewall between climate and development finance. And I think it also means something about how DFID in particular is going to kind of respond to this challenge, which we're certainly thinking about as well internally at the moment.
Andrea, thank you very much. So hold your questions a little bit longer. I'll turn to Ilmi. Ilmi, you've been leading work with ODI, CDKN and others on zero poverty is zero emissions. We put the two zeros together. I hope this report provides extra evidence on these interconnections.
Thank you, Sam. This is on? Yeah. First of all, I want to congratulate the team that put this together. What is truly a Sisyphean task, if I ever saw one. I certainly would have avoided the commission to do it, and I thought you've narrowed it in very sensible ways. I mean, we are sort of baked into a particular framework for talking about the Sustainable Development Goals that include such a broad range of objectives, and focusing on a few but still trying to crunch some numbers is really, I think, wise and sensible. The clear conclusions that you come to of their interrelationship, I think, is very helpful. In some ways, our work on the relationship between zero poverty and zero emissions and these two goals should have come after this and would have been very helpful to build on this. But unfortunately, we didn't have the time to sequence everything out. We really very much in our own research focused on a much narrower set of goals, and to say if staying within 2 degrees means zero net emissions by at the absolute latest, to have more likely than not scenario of staying within 2 degrees that we need to get to zero net emissions before the end of the century. And we also have a eradication of poverty goal to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. What is the interrelationship between those goals? And even that is quite a hard one to tease out in the detail. But I am struck by at one level, the shared view that ambition on climate mitigation is a key way of delivering development, and particularly poverty eradication, and that some form of sustainable development as a way of going about development is the way we'll deliver a low carbon outcome. I want to congratulate you and then focus on some of the challenges that I saw to take your conclusions one step further. First of all, with respect to Paris, I would say that one of the conclusions I would draw from both your work and ours is that it's not only about Paris, in fact, that what we see is if we are talking about peaking emissions, your peaking emissions trajectory was actually sooner than the one that we focused on. If we're really talking about global peaking emissions, and even the laggard countries that have a little bit more time peaking emissions before the middle of the century, that's well within the life cycle of existing infrastructure investments. And that means that our choices as to how we go about promoting domestic development, really the deep decarbonization for all countries and the thinking around that has to happen now. And that's a much stronger message than just that we need ambition on Paris. It's to say that domestic development agendas universally have to really be thinking about this decarbonization trajectory. That's not to be confused with the message that all countries have already peaked and must decline. Clearly, the developed countries should be thinking about that seriously, but it does mean that all decisions now need to be in the context of moving towards zero net emissions, and that the consequence of not doing that is at best a Pyrrhic victory on poverty, where in best case scenario, we do reduce poverty over the next 15 years quite significantly, but lock ourselves into much greater poverty going forward because of the impacts of climate change. And so the implication in my mind is not only that we need ambition on Paris, but that the conversation around Paris is only one dimension of where we need climate ambition, and it's now really incumbent upon countries to race towards deep decarbonization in each instance. So we agree with that level of ambition and take it one step further. Also, on the Sustainable Development Goals, I think the hardest challenge here is what ambition looks like. I was at a talk with my former boss, Mark Malloch Brown, on Friday, and he observed that what we lack now is some form of global manifesto that really focuses attention, something really well written and short, that focuses attention around a few themes. I would offer zero poverty and zero emissions as a way of focusing our attention. Within a generation, as a way of focusing our attention and narrowing our focus, and as a strategy for achieving sustainable development, because of poverty. Because that's the moral floor of development. That is the benchmark against which we will be judged. And if we fail to address climate change, we will just fail on poverty eradication. I think the implications that this highlights, in particular, if we're trying to focus on a narrower sort of manifesto, it's that is the interconnectedness of our domestic development choices. And what that means is, I think, for example, the UK government's domestic action on mitigation, where it is strong, should be lauded as delivering poverty reduction globally. And where it is weak, should be acknowledged to be failing on the poverty agenda. And that we should be thinking of our domestic decarbonization pathway in terms of its ability to deliver poverty reduction globally, because of the interconnectedness that climate change brings our attention to. And that is one of the implications of the linkage between these two goals. And likewise, in countries that have significant amounts of extreme poverty, that their ambition for eradicating that poverty really needs to take into account that they are trying to resolve that problem in a world where it's not that a certain set of countries are putting conditionalities on the nature of their development, but that nature has put some conditionalities on the nature of how we will be able to eradicate poverty. And so I think that is the implication of these two bits. And so I would just take it that one step further in teasing out what your evidence shows.
Okay, Ilmi, thank you very much indeed. I think there's some good challenges there on taking this further. Indeed, that's what we're keen to do. So to help us do that, we would love to get your response. There may be some points of clarification around the methodology, but also we'd like to hear your views. If you speak, could you speak briefly to the point, but first introduce yourself. And if you don't use a microphone, you won't be heard by those online. So I'll take some questions in the room, but if there are colleagues online, I'd welcome your questions as well. So Charlotte has a microphone, and I have a couple of hands here in the middle, so why don't we start here? Maybe I'll take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll come back to the panelists.